Picture this. It's October 19th, 1781, and you're a British grenadier standing in a field outside Yorktown, Virginia. Your red coat is filthy. Your boots are falling apart. You haven't had a proper meal in weeks. The smell of death hangs in the air so thick you can taste it. Around you, 8,000 British soldiers are forming ranks for the last time, not to fight, to surrender. Your hands are shaking as you stack your musket with the others. You've been told to march out with your flags cased, hidden in shame. The French are playing a victory march. The Americans are standing silent, watching you with the quiet satisfaction of men who weren't supposed to win. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a question burns. How did this happen? How did the most powerful army on Earth, the force that conquered half the globe, end up trapped in this God-forsaken Virginia swamp, starving, diseased, and beaten by a ragtag collection of farmers and shopkeepers? The answer lies in 72 hours of military brilliance, tactical desperation, and the complete collapse of British imperial confidence. This isn't just the story of a siege. It's the story of how 8,000 professional soldiers were systematically destroyed by an American army that learned to fight like Europeans while thinking like frontiersmen. This is the siege of Yorktown, and before those 72 hours of hell began, the stage had been set by 6 years of blood, betrayal, and the slow realization that this wasn't a rebellion anymore. It was a war America intended to win. To understand how badly things went wrong for the British at Yorktown, you have to understand how confident they were just months earlier. By 1780, the Revolutionary War had been raging for 5 years, and from London's perspective, victory was inevitable. It was just taking longer than expected. The British strategy in the South was working perfectly. They had captured Savannah in Georgia. They had taken Charleston, South Carolina, along with 5,000 American prisoners, the worst American defeat of the entire war. They had a brilliant, aggressive commander named Lord Charles Cornwallis leading an army of seasoned veterans. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Conquer the southern colonies first, then march north, rolling up the rebellion like a carpet. The southern colonists, they believed, were more loyal to the crown. Once the British army arrived to protect them, thousands of loyalists would flock to the king's banner. The rebellion would collapse from the bottom up. For a while, it worked. Cornwallis won battle after battle. At Camden in August 1780, he shattered an American army, killing or capturing 2,000 men. The American commander, Horatio Gates, the supposed hero of Saratoga, ran so fast from the battlefield that he covered 60 miles in one day on horseback. It was humiliating. The Americans seemed broken. But here's what the British didn't understand about fighting in America. Winning battles didn't mean winning the war. The Americans had something the British didn't have, nowhere else to go. This was their home. When they lost a battle, they didn't sail back to England to lick their wounds. They melted into the woods, nursed their injuries, and came back angrier. The Southern campaign that looked so good on paper became a nightmare in practice. Cornwallis was winning battles, but he was losing the war. Every time he marched his army forward, American partisans attacked his supply lines. Loyalist support turned out to be a mirage. Most Southerners just wanted to be left alone, and when the British demanded they actively fight for the crown, many switched sides. The British treated the civilian population brutally, burning farms, hanging suspected rebels, and allowing their loyalist allies to settle old grudges with violence. This didn't create loyalty. It created rage. The partisan leaders, men like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, Thomas Sumter, the Gamecock, and Andrew Pickens, made life hell for the British. They didn't fight fair. They didn't line up in neat rows. They ambushed supply wagons, assassinated loyalist leaders, and vanished into swamps and forests the British couldn't navigate. Cornwallis found himself chasing ghosts. And then came a fight that changed everything. The Battle of Cowpens in January 1781. An American general named Daniel Morgan, a tough old frontiersman who'd been fighting since the French and Indian War, set a trap for the British commander Benedict Tarleton. Tarleton was the most feared cavalry officer in the British Army, known for his speed and his brutality. He'd earned the nickname Bloody Ban for refusing to give quarter to surrendering Americans. Morgan knew Tarleton's weakness. He was arrogant, aggressive, and reckless. So Morgan chose a battlefield with a river at his back, the kind of position military textbooks said you should never occupy. It looked like a desperate mistake. Tarleton saw it and smiled. He thought he'd cornered the Americans. He charged headlong into Morgan's position. What Tarleton didn't know was that Morgan had set up his troops in 3 lines, each with specific orders. The first line, militia, was told to fire 2 volleys and then retreat. The second line, more militia, would hold longer, then pull back. The third line, Continental regulars, was the anvil. When Tarleton's troops crashed into the first line, everything went exactly as Morgan planned. The militia fired and ran, just as Tarleton expected. He thought they were breaking. He pushed forward, straight into the second line. They fired and retreated. Tarleton's men were getting strung out now, their formation loosening as they pursued what they thought was a fleeing enemy. Then they hit the third line. The Continentals didn't run. They fired a devastating volley at point-blank range, then charged with bayonets. At the same moment, the militia that had retreated circled around and hit Tarleton's flanks. American cavalry smashed into his rear. In less than an hour, Tarleton's force was destroyed. The British lost 100 dead, 200 wounded, and 600 captured. The Americans lost 12 dead and 60 wounded. It was the most lopsided tactical victory of the war. Cornwallis was furious when he heard the news. He'd lost 1/10 of his army in a single morning, but instead of retreating to a secure base, he made a decision that would lead him straight to Yorktown. He decided to chase down the American Southern Army, now commanded by Nathaniel Greene, and destroy it once and for all. This began one of the strangest chases in military history. Cornwallis pursued Greene across North Carolina in the winter of 1781. Greene stayed just out of reach, retreating, but making the British pay for every mile. Cornwallis, desperate to catch him, made a radical decision. He ordered his army to burn their baggage wagons, their tents, their spare supplies, everything that slowed them down. He wanted to move fast and light. His officers thought he'd gone mad. You don't burn your supplies in enemy territory in the middle of winter. But Cornwallis was obsessed. The chase ended at Guilford Courthouse in March 1781. Greene finally turned and fought. The battle was brutal, close quarters fighting in woods and fields. Greene used the same tactics as Morgan at Cowpens, layering his troops in lines. The British won technically. They held the field at the end of the day. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. Cornwallis lost over 500 men, more than a quarter of his force. Greene lost fewer and simply walked away, his army intact. A British politician later said of Guilford Courthouse, "Another such victory would ruin the British army." That's exactly what happened. Cornwallis was stuck in the interior of North Carolina with a battered, undersupplied army. He couldn't catch Greene. He couldn't hold territory. The partisans were bleeding him dry. So he made another fateful decision. He marched to the coast. His reasoning was sound, in theory. The Royal Navy controlled the ocean. If he could reach a port, he could resupply, receive reinforcements, and establish a secure base. From there, he could coordinate with British forces in the north and squeeze the Americans from both ends. He chose Yorktown, Virginia, a small tobacco port on the York River. It had a decent harbor. It was close to Chesapeake Bay where the Navy could easily reach him. In late summer 1781, Cornwallis and his 8,000 soldiers marched into Yorktown and started building fortifications. From his perspective, it was a reasonable move. He was tired, his men were exhausted, and he needed a rest. The Navy would protect him from the sea. His fortifications would protect him from land. What could go wrong? Everything. Because while Cornwallis was digging in at Yorktown, 2 other men were putting together the most audacious plan of the entire war. Their names were George Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau, and they were about to pull off one of the greatest strategic deceptions in military history. Let's be clear about the situation in the summer of 1781. The Americans were not winning. They were surviving. The Continental Army had been fighting for 6 years. Soldiers hadn't been paid in months. Some units were wearing rags. Ammunition was scarce. Morale was low. Mutinies had broken out in Pennsylvania and New Jersey earlier that year. The British held New York City, the largest port in America, with a garrison of over 15,000 men. They held Newport, Rhode Island. They controlled the southern colonies. The French had entered the war in 1778, which had been crucial. They provided money, weapons, and legitimacy. But so far, Franco-American military cooperation had been a disaster. Joint operations in Rhode Island and Savannah had failed miserably. The Allies didn't trust each other, didn't communicate well, and couldn't coordinate their movements. Washington's main army and Rochambeau's French force were camped north of New York City, staring at the British fortifications and accomplishing nothing. Washington was desperate to attack New York. He'd been driven out of the city in 1776 in a humiliating defeat, and he wanted it back. It was a matter of pride, strategy, and symbolism. But Rochambeau quietly, politely told Washington it was impossible. The British defenses were too strong. They didn't have enough men or artillery. An attack would fail, and failure might end the revolution. Then, in August 1781, Rochambeau received a letter from the French admiral, the Comte de Grasse. De Grasse commanded the French West Indies fleet, the most powerful naval force in the western Atlantic. His letter said he was sailing north with 28 ships of the line and 3,000 French troops. He would arrive in late August and could stay until mid-October, but not a day longer. He had to return to the Caribbean before hurricane season. Where should he go? Rochambeau and Washington looked at a map. De Grasse couldn't get his big warships into New York Harbor. The waters were too shallow, the British defenses too strong. But Chesapeake Bay was wide open, and sitting at the top of Chesapeake Bay, exposed and vulnerable, was Cornwallis at Yorktown. Washington saw it immediately. If the French fleet could control the bay, Cornwallis would be cut off from the sea. If the American and French armies could march south fast enough, they could trap him on land. It was a window of opportunity that would slam shut the moment de Grasse had to leave. Everything depended on timing, secrecy, and the Royal Navy not interfering. It was an insane gamble. Washington loved it. He had to convince his officers, many of whom still wanted to attack New York. He had to convince the French, who were skeptical of such a long, complicated march. And most importantly, he had to keep the British in New York from figuring out what he was doing. Because if the British commander, Sir Henry Clinton, realized Washington was abandoning the siege of New York, Clinton could send reinforcements to Cornwallis by sea, or he could attack the weakened American positions around New York. Either way, the plan would collapse. So, Washington lied. He launched one of the most elaborate deceptions in military history. He had his engineers build massive bread ovens north of New York, the kind you'd need to feed an army preparing for a long siege. He sent foraging parties into New Jersey to requisition food and supplies, loudly announcing they were preparing for a major attack on Staten Island. He had his staff circulate maps of New York Harbor and leaked fake invasion plans. British spies in the American camps reported all of this back to Clinton. Clinton looked at the intelligence and nodded. Washington was finally going to attack New York. He reinforced his garrison and waited. Meanwhile, Washington quietly began moving his army south. He marched the Continental Army and Rochambeau's French forces across New Jersey under the cover of night. They moved in small groups to avoid detection. They stayed inland, away from British naval patrols. The soldiers didn't know where they were going. Even most of the officers didn't know. Thousands of men marched south in the oppressive August heat, confused, exhausted, and wondering what their commander was thinking. It wasn't until they reached Philadelphia that Washington revealed the plan. They were going to Virginia. They were going to trap Cornwallis. They were going to end this war. The army erupted in cheers. The French band played Yankee Doodle. The city went wild. Civilians lined the streets, throwing flowers and shouting encouragement as the Allied army marched through. Washington didn't stop to celebrate. Every hour mattered. De Grasse was supposed to arrive in Chesapeake Bay at the end of August. If he was delayed, if he was intercepted by the British, if anything went wrong, the entire plan would fall apart. Washington pushed his men hard. They covered 12 miles a day in brutal heat. Men collapsed from exhaustion and heat stroke. But they kept moving. Meanwhile, Cornwallis was sitting in Yorktown, completely oblivious. He sent cheerful letters to Clinton describing his fortifications. He reported that the position was strong, supplies were adequate, and morale was good. He expected reinforcements soon. Everything was under control. He had no idea what was coming. The first sign that something was wrong came at the end of August. A lookout in Yorktown spotted sails on the horizon. Lots of sails. A massive fleet was entering Chesapeake Bay. Cornwallis assumed it was the Royal Navy bringing supplies and reinforcements. He was half right about the fleet being large. He was completely wrong about whose flag it was flying. It was de Grasse. The French admiral had arrived right on schedule with 28 ships of the line, 4 frigates, and 3,000 soldiers. He took one look at the geography and smiled. Chesapeake Bay was a perfect trap. There were only 2 entrances, one at the northern end and one at the southern. De Grasse positioned his fleet across both. No one was getting in or out without his permission. Cornwallis watched from the shore as the French ships dropped anchor. His stomach dropped. He was cut off from the sea. He immediately sent urgent messages to Clinton in New York, begging for help. Clinton received the messages and panicked. He'd been completely fooled by Washington's deception. The American army was gone. They weren't attacking New York. They were marching to Virginia. He'd sent some reinforcements to Cornwallis earlier, but nowhere near enough. Now he scrambled to organize a relief expedition. But he had a problem. He didn't control the sea anymore. The Royal Navy had 19 ships in New York under Admiral Thomas Graves. De Grasse had 28 in the Chesapeake. Graves was outnumbered and outgunned, but he was the only hope Cornwallis had. On September 5, 1781, the two fleets met in a naval battle that would decide the fate of the war. The Battle of the Chesapeake, sometimes called the Battle of the Virginia Capes, was not a dramatic slugfest of broadsides and boarding actions. It was a cautious, methodical fight between two admirals who understood the stakes. Graves sailed his fleet south from New York and spotted de Grasse's ships anchored in the bay. De Grasse saw the British coming and ordered his fleet to weigh anchor and sail out to meet them. This took hours. Ships of the line don't move quickly. The two fleets maneuvered for position, trying to get the wind advantage. Finally, in the late afternoon, they formed parallel lines and began firing. The battle lasted 2 hours. Both sides hammered each other with cannon fire. Ships were damaged. Masts were shattered. Hundreds of sailors died, but neither side broke. As the sun set, both fleets pulled back to lick their wounds. For the next 5 days, they shadowed each other off the Virginia coast, neither willing to commit to a decisive engagement. Then, de Grasse received reinforcements. 8 more French ships arrived from Newport, Rhode Island, under Admiral de Barras. De Grasse now had 36 ships to Graves' 19. Graves looked at the odds, looked at his damaged fleet, and made the hardest decision of his career. He turned around and sailed back to New York. The battle had been a tactical draw, but a strategic disaster for Britain. De Grasse controlled Chesapeake Bay. Cornwallis was now completely isolated. The trap had closed. On September 28, 1781, George Washington arrived outside Yorktown with an army of 16,000 men, 8,000 Americans and 8,000 French. Cornwallis had 8,000 British and German troops dug in behind fortifications. On paper, it looked like a fair fight. It wasn't. Cornwallis was trapped with his back to a river he couldn't cross and a navy he couldn't reach. Washington had him surrounded on land. De Grasse had him blockaded from the sea. There was no escape. There was no relief coming. There was only the question of how long Cornwallis could hold out and how many men would die before he admitted the inevitable. Washington, who'd spent 6 years learning the hard way how to fight this war, knew exactly what to do. He was going to besiege Yorktown the old-fashioned European way, with trenches, artillery, and patience. The American and French forces outnumbered the British 2-1. They had 90 artillery pieces, including massive siege guns brought from de Grasse's ships. They had French engineers who'd studied siege warfare at the finest military academies in Europe. They had time, supplies, and morale. Cornwallis had hope, which was rapidly evaporating. The siege of Yorktown began on September 28th and would last 3 weeks. But the truly catastrophic 72 hours, the final collapse of British resistance, came in mid-October. To understand those 72 hours, you need to understand the architecture of an 18th century siege. Yorktown was a small town, on a bluff overlooking the York River. Cornwallis had spent months fortifying it. His men had dug a main defensive line of trenches and earthworks ringing the town. In front of this line, they had built 10 redoubts, small fortified positions manned by infantry and artillery. These redoubts acted as early warning posts and firing positions. They extended the British defensive perimeter and made it harder for attackers to get close to the main line. On the other side of the York River, at a place called Gloucester Point, Cornwallis had established a small secondary position with about 1,000 men. This was supposed to be his escape route if things went badly. It didn't help. The French and Americans surrounded Gloucester Point too. Washington's plan was methodical. First, surround the entire British position and cut off any hope of escape or resupply. Second, dig approach trenches called parallels to get close enough for artillery to pound the British fortifications. Third, once the British defenses were weakened, storm the remaining redoubts and push the siege lines even closer. Fourth, bombard the town into submission until Cornwallis had no choice but to surrender. It was siege warfare by the book. Washington had studied the European masters. He knew that if he did this right, he could take Yorktown without losing thousands of men in futile frontal assaults. Time was on his side. Cornwallis started running out of everything almost immediately. Food was short, fresh water was scarce. Medicine was non-existent. Smallpox broke out in the British camps. Men were dying every day from disease. The British tried to slow the American approach. Their artillery fired day and night at the work parties digging the trenches. But the Americans dug at night, using the darkness as cover. By day they rested in the completed sections of trench, protected from British fire. Inch by inch, foot by foot, the noose tightened. On October 6th, the Americans completed their first parallel, a long trench line about 600 yards from the British positions. That night, Washington personally fired the first American artillery shot of the siege. It was a ceremonial gesture, but it mattered. The commander-in-chief was here, in the mud, with his men. The bombardment began in earnest the next morning. 90 American and French cannons opened fire simultaneously. The noise was apocalyptic. Shells screamed through the air and exploded inside Yorktown. Buildings caught fire. The British ships anchored in the river were hit and sank. Men died in their sleep when shells burst in their tents. The bombardment continued 24 hours a day. There was no rest, no silence. The psychological impact was devastating. British soldiers huddled in their trenches, listening to the whistle of incoming shells, never knowing if the next one had their name on it. Cornwallis sent desperate letters to Clinton, begging for reinforcements. He wrote that he could hold out a few more weeks maybe, but his position was deteriorating rapidly. He needed help now. Clinton wrote back with promises. A relief fleet was being prepared. 5,000 men would sail from New York. They would break the French blockade and rescue the garrison. All Cornwallis had to do was hold on. It was a lie, or at least a fantasy. Clinton had no idea how to break through de Grasse's fleet. The relief expedition wouldn't sail for weeks. Even if it did, it would arrive too late. Cornwallis didn't know this yet. He clung to hope and ordered his men to endure. They endured as best they could. British artillery returned fire, but they were running out of ammunition. They rationed their powder, firing only at the most important targets. The American and French guns never stopped. By October 9th, the Allied forces had pounded the British positions so hard that they were ready to start digging a second parallel, even closer to the enemy lines. This second trench would be only 300 yards from the British fortifications, well within musket range. It would allow the attackers to bring up more artillery and fire directly into the British trenches. But there was a problem. Two British redoubts, Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10, stuck out from the main line like thorns. They flanked the area where the second parallel needed to go. As long as those redoubts were occupied, the Americans couldn't dig their trench without being slaughtered. The redoubts had to be taken. Washington ordered an assault for the night of October 14th. This was it. This was the decisive moment. This was the beginning of the 72 hours that would destroy the British position and end the siege. Two assault forces were organized. The French would attack Redoubt 9. The Americans would attack Redoubt 10. Both assaults would launch simultaneously at night to maximize surprise. The French chose a regiment of elite grenadiers for the job. The Americans held a lottery among their regiments for the honor of leading the attack. The men wanted this. They'd been digging trenches and dodging artillery for 2 weeks. They wanted to fight. The honor went to a battalion of light infantry under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton. Yes, that Alexander Hamilton, the same man who would later become the first Secretary of the Treasury. In 1781, he was a young, ambitious officer desperate to prove himself in combat. He'd spent most of the war as Washington's aide-de-camp, writing letters and managing paperwork. He was brilliant at it, but he hated it. He wanted glory. He wanted to be in the fight. He'd begged Washington for a field command. Washington finally gave it to him for this assault. Hamilton picked his best men, about 400 soldiers. He gave them specific orders. They would advance in total silence. No one would load their muskets. They would attack with bayonets only. Speed and shock were everything. If they stopped to fire, they'd lose momentum and the British would cut them down. This wasn't a firefight. This was a knife fight in the dark. At 8 o'clock on the night of October 14th, the signal was given. The American and French assault columns moved out of their trenches and advanced across the open ground toward the redoubts. The night was dark. The only light came from the burning buildings in Yorktown and the occasional flash of artillery fire. The American column moved quickly, staying low, trying to stay invisible. They could see Redoubt 10 ahead, a dark earthwork bristling with sharpened wooden stakes called abattis. British sentries stood on the ramparts, silhouetted against the fires behind them. The Americans got to within 50 yards before they were spotted. A British sentry shouted a challenge. Hamilton raised his sword and screamed, "Charge!" The Americans sprinted forward. The British opened fire. Musket balls zipped through the darkness. Men fell. But the Americans didn't stop. They hit the abattis, a wall of sharpened logs designed to stop exactly this kind of assault. Hamilton didn't slow down. He personally started tearing at the stakes with his bare hands. His men followed. They ripped the abattis apart, climbed over it, and poured into the redoubt. The fight inside was brutal and chaotic. Bayonets flashed in the darkness. Men grappled hand to hand, too close to shoot, stabbing and clubbing each other. The Americans had surprise and numbers. The British had desperation. It lasted less than 10 minutes. The British garrison, only about 70 men, was overwhelmed. Some surrendered, some died, the rest ran. Hamilton's men secured the redoubt and turned its guns around to face the British main line. American casualties, 9 dead, 25 wounded. It was a textbook assault, aggressive, fast, and decisive. Meanwhile, the French assault on Redoubt 9 was having a harder time. The French force was larger, over 400 men, but Redoubt 9 was bigger and more heavily defended. The French approached in their traditional methodical style. They paused to cut through the abattis carefully, forming ranks before charging. This gave the British defenders time to organize their defense. The fighting was longer and bloodier, but the outcome was the same. The French took the redoubt after a fierce struggle. French casualties were higher, 15 dead, 77 wounded, but they'd done the job. Both redoubts were now in Allied hands. The second parallel could be completed. Washington received the news and smiled. It was the first time in weeks he had allowed himself to feel optimistic. The noose was tightening. Cornwallis, watching from his headquarters, knew what this meant. The Allies would now move their artillery forward into the captured redoubts. They'd pound his main line from 300 yards away. His fortifications, already battered, wouldn't hold. He had days, maybe hours, before his position became completely untenable. He made one last desperate attempt to break out. On the night of October 16th, Cornwallis ordered a surprise attack on the Allied siege lines. It was a spoiling attack, designed to buy time by destroying some of the American artillery. He picked 350 of his best men, gave them orders to move fast, wreck as much as they could, and get back before dawn. The British raiding party slipped out of their lines around 3 in the morning. They crept through the darkness toward the American positions. They got lucky. The sentries were tired, and some were asleep. The British got close before being detected. Then they charged, screaming and firing. They hit a section of the American trench line and spiked several cannons, driving iron spikes into the touch holes so the guns couldn't be fired. They bayoneted sleeping soldiers and caused chaos. For about 20 minutes, it looked like a success. Then the Americans counterattacked. Reinforcements poured into the breach. The British raiders, outnumbered and deep in enemy territory, had to retreat. They ran back to their lines, leaving their dead behind. The Americans surveyed the damage. A few cannons were spiked, which was annoying but fixable. You could drill out a spike in a couple of hours. A dozen men were dead, but the raid hadn't changed anything. The siege continued. Cornwallis tried one more gamble. He decided to evacuate his army across the York River to Gloucester Point under cover of darkness. From there, he'd try to break through the Allied forces and march north to link up with British forces in the Carolinas, or even try to reach New York. It was insane. It was also his only option. On the night of October 16th, he began loading his men into boats. The plan was to ferry the entire army across the river in multiple trips. The first wave, about 1,000 men, made it across successfully. Cornwallis watched from the Yorktown shore as the boats returned for the second wave. Then the weather turned. A massive storm blew in from the Atlantic. Thunder, lightning, and torrential rain hammered the river. The wind whipped the water into whitecaps. The boats couldn't cross. They'd be swamped and sunk. Cornwallis stood in the rain, watching his last hope wash away. At dawn, he recalled the troops from Gloucester Point. The evacuation was called off. The storm, some said, was an act of God. Whether divine intervention or just bad luck, it didn't matter. Cornwallis was finished. He had no options left. His fortifications were in ruins. His men were starving. Disease was rampant. Ammunition was nearly gone. The Allied artillery was now so close that British soldiers couldn't move without being targeted. Men were being killed in their trenches, unable to even fire back. On the morning of October 17th, a British drummer boy climbed up onto the parapet of the British defenses. He began beating out the signal for a parley, the request to talk. No one could hear the drum at first. The American and French cannons were still firing, but slowly soldiers noticed the boy standing there, exposed and vulnerable, beating his drum. One by one, the Allied guns fell silent. In the sudden quiet, an officer appeared next to the drummer, waving a white handkerchief. The siege of Yorktown was over. The negotiations took 2 days. Cornwallis wanted generous terms. He wanted his army to be paroled, allowed to return to British-controlled territory without being held as prisoners. He wanted the loyalists who'd fought for the crown to be protected. He wanted to surrender with full military honors, marching out with flags flying and drums beating. Washington refused most of it. The British would surrender as prisoners of war. They would march out with their flags cased, rolled up and hidden, a mark of shame. They would not be allowed to play American or French music. Loyalists would not be protected. As for parole, Washington said he'd treat the British exactly as the British had treated American prisoners after the fall of Charleston. Cornwallis had no leverage to negotiate. He accepted the terms. On October 19, 1781, at 2 in the afternoon, the British Army marched out of Yorktown to surrender. 8,000 men formed ranks in a field between 2 lines of Allied soldiers. On one side stood the Americans, rough, ragged, many without proper uniforms, but standing tall and silent. On the other side stood the French, immaculate in white coats and perfect formation, a professional European army. The British marched between them. The British military band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down," which was probably apocryphal but symbolically perfect. Everything the British thought they knew about war, power, and empire had been shattered. Cornwallis himself didn't attend. He claimed he was sick. He sent his second-in-command, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, to surrender in his place. O'Hara tried to surrender to Rochambeau, offering his sword to the French commander instead of the American. It was a final insult, a refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of the American army. Rochambeau wasn't having it. He pointed to Washington. O'Hara turned to Washington. Washington refused to accept the sword of a subordinate. He pointed to his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln. Lincoln had been the American commander forced to surrender at Charleston. The British had humiliated him, making his men march out with flags cased. Now Lincoln would return the favor. He accepted O'Hara's sword, then immediately handed it back. It was a gesture of professional courtesy, but also a power move. We beat you, but we're not savages. The British soldiers marched to a field and stacked their arms. Some were crying, some were drunk, some threw their muskets down so hard they tried to break them. American and French soldiers watched in silence. No one cheered. There was no gloating. They had won, but they were tired. This had been a long war. The surrender took hours. 8,000 muskets, hundreds of cannons, mountains of equipment. When it was done, the British prisoners were marched away to prison camps. The Loyalists who'd fought for the crown were left to fend for themselves. Many were later hunted down and killed by Venginger's patriots. It was ugly, but war is ugly. Washington wrote to Congress immediately. His letter was brief and to the point. I have the honor to inform Congress that a reduction of the British Army under the command of Lord Cornwallis is most happily effected. Most happily effected. That might be the most understated way to announce the end of a war in history. The news spread like wildfire. Riders carried it north to Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. Church bells rang. People poured into the streets. Taverns ran out of alcohol. It felt like victory, but the war wasn't technically over. The British still held New York, Charleston, and Savannah. King George III, when he heard about Yorktown, reportedly paced his room, repeating, "Oh God, it is all over." His Prime Minister, Lord North, took the news as he would have taken a ball in his breast, according to witnesses. He knew what it meant. Britain couldn't win this war, not militarily. The cost in blood and money was unsustainable. The French, Spanish, and Dutch were all fighting Britain now. The empire was stretched too thin. Yorktown was the breaking point. Parliament began serious peace negotiations. It would take 2 more years to finalize the Treaty of Paris, but the outcome was inevitable. America had won its independence. The significance of Yorktown goes far beyond the military statistics. Yes, Washington and Rochambeau had trapped and destroyed a British army. Yes, 8,000 British soldiers had surrendered. Yes, it was a tactical and strategic masterpiece. But the real importance was psychological and political. Yorktown proved that the Americans could fight and win a European-style conventional war. They had beaten the British at their own game, not through guerrilla tactics or frontier ambushes, but through proper siege warfare, artillery, and discipline. It legitimized the American cause in the eyes of Europe. It showed that this wasn't a rabble of farmers with pitchforks. This was a professional army capable of coordinating with European allies and defeating the strongest military power on Earth. It shattered British confidence and unified the fractured American colonies. For 6 years, the revolution had been on the brink of collapse multiple times. After Yorktown, independence felt inevitable. The 72 hours from October 14th to October 17th, from the assault on the redoubts to the white flag of surrender, represented the culmination of everything the Americans had learned since Lexington and Concord. They'd learned to build an army from nothing. They'd learned to fight retreating actions and survive catastrophic defeats. They'd learned to endure winters at Valley Forge and Morristown. They'd learned to accept help from the French without losing their identity. And they'd learned that winning a revolution required more than courage. It required patience, strategy, and the ability to recognize the perfect moment when it arrived. Washington recognized that moment. When he heard that de Grasse was sailing north, when he saw Cornwallis trapped at Yorktown, he knew this was it. This was the opportunity that might never come again. He marched his army 400 miles in scorching heat. He coordinated with the French on a level of complexity that had failed in every previous attempt. He deceived the British in New York so completely that they didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. And when he arrived at Yorktown, he didn't rush. He didn't waste lives on futile assaults. He besieged the position properly, professionally, and waited for Cornwallis to run out of options. The 72 hours of fighting, from the night assault on the redoubts to the final surrender, were the payoff for 6 years of learning how to fight this kind of war. Hamilton's charge on Redoubt 10 wasn't just brave, it was tactically perfect. Silent approach, overwhelming speed, bayonets only, no hesitation. It's the kind of assault you can only pull off with disciplined troops who trust their commander and each other. The Americans who fought at Yorktown weren't the same militia who'd run away at Kip's Bay in 1776. Or panicked at Camden in 1780. They were veterans. They'd been forged in the fires of defeats, near starvation, and betrayal. They had watched their friends die and their country suffer, and when the moment came, they didn't break. They charged into the darkness and they took those redoubts. The British, for their part, fought as well as they could under impossible circumstances. Cornwallis was a good general who made bad strategic decisions. His march into Virginia was a mistake. His choice of Yorktown as a base was a mistake. His assumption that the Royal Navy would always control the sea was a mistake. But his soldiers fought hard. They endured weeks of bombardment. They launched counterattacks even when defeat was certain. They weren't cowards. They were professionals trapped in an impossible situation. When they marched out to surrender, they weren't surrendering because they'd been defeated in battle. They were surrendering because they'd been outmaneuvered, outthought, and abandoned by their own Navy and high command. The horror of those 72 hours wasn't just the violence, though there was plenty of that. It was the grinding inevitability. Once the redoubts fell, everyone knew what was coming. The British knew, the Americans knew, the French knew. The only question was how long Cornwallis would hold out, and how many more men would die before he accepted reality. In the end, he held out as long as he could, then accepted the inevitable. That's not cowardice, that's pragmatism. There's no point in letting your men die for a lost cause. The real tragedy was the Loyalists. Thousands of American colonists had sided with the Crown during the war. Some were ideological monarchists who genuinely believed in British rule. Others were opportunists who thought the British would win. Many were just trying to protect their property and families in a civil war where neutrality was dangerous. After Yorktown, they were abandoned. The Treaty of Paris included vague language about protecting Loyalist property, but it was never enforced. Patriot mobs attacked Loyalist families. Thousands fled to Canada, the Caribbean, or back to Britain. They lost everything. The American Revolution was a war of independence, but it was also a civil war, and civil wars don't end with everyone shaking hands. The bitterness lasted for generations, but for the Patriots, Yorktown was vindication. Every frozen night at Valley Forge, every lost battle, every moment when it seemed like the cause was hopeless, had led to this. The long-term impact of Yorktown on world history can't be overstated. The birth of the United States created the first modern republic in the Western world. It proved that people could govern themselves without kings or aristocrats. That idea, radical in 1781, would spread across the globe. The French Revolution in 1789 was directly inspired by the American example. So were the Latin American independence movements in the early 1800s. The wave of democratic revolutions in Europe in 1848 looked back to America as proof that it could be done. American independence changed the global balance of power. Britain lost its most valuable colonies, but learned from the experience. The British Empire would rebuild and become even larger in the 19th century, but it would govern its remaining colonies differently, with more flexibility and less direct control. The loss of America taught them that holding territory by force alone doesn't work. France, ironically, bankrupted itself helping America win independence. The French monarchy spent so much money supporting the American Revolution that it triggered a financial crisis at home. That crisis led directly to the French Revolution, which overthrew the same monarchy that had helped create American democracy. King Louis XVI signed his own death warrant when he signed the alliance with America. The American military tradition that emerged from the Revolution, including Yorktown, shaped how Americans think about war even today. The emphasis on the citizen soldier, the distrust of standing armies, the belief that Americans fight differently and better than professional European soldiers, all of that comes from the Revolutionary War. It's mythology, partially, but it's mythology rooted in real events like Yorktown, where an army of former farmers and shopkeepers outfought the British Empire. The tactical lessons of Yorktown were studied by military academies for decades. The coordination between the American, French, and naval forces became a template for coalition warfare. The use of siege artillery, the night assault on fortified positions, the psychological warfare of constant bombardment, all of these techniques were analyzed and copied. But perhaps the most important lesson was strategic patience. Washington spent 6 years losing battles, retreating, avoiding decisive engagements. He was criticized for it constantly. His officers wanted to fight. Congress wanted victories. The public wanted their general to act like a hero from a storybook. Washington ignored them. He understood that his job wasn't to win battles. It was to keep the army alive until the British made a mistake or circumstances changed in his favor. That's exactly what happened. Cornwallis made the mistake of trapping himself at Yorktown. De Grasse created the circumstances by controlling the sea. Washington was ready when the moment came because he'd spent 6 years preparing his army for exactly this kind of operation. That's not luck, that's strategy. And when the moment came, he executed perfectly. The march from New York to Virginia, the deception of Clinton, the coordination with the French, the siege itself, all of it worked because Washington had learned from his mistakes and his army had learned to trust him. The soldiers who stacked their muskets at Yorktown on October 19th had been through hell. Some had been fighting since Lexington and Concord in 1775, 6.5 years of war. They'd seen friends die, been wounded themselves, gone months without pay, marched hundreds of miles in rags, starved, frozen, and watched their country burn. They'd earned the right to celebrate, and they did celebrate, but quietly. There's a story, probably apocryphal, that after the surrender, an American soldier approached one of his British prisoners and said, "You fellows fought well." The British soldier replied, "So did you." That's the nature of respect between professional soldiers. They'd been trying to kill each other for days, but now that it was over, they could acknowledge that both sides had done their duty. The French were less sentimental. They'd come to America for geopolitical reasons, to hurt Britain and restore French prestige after losing the 7 Years' War. They succeeded brilliantly. France had its revenge. The fact that it bankrupted the monarchy and led to revolution was an unintended consequence they'd deal with later. For now, they celebrated. Rochambeau and his officers were feted as heroes. The French soldiers were impressed by the Americans, whom they had expected to be undisciplined rabble. Instead, they found veterans who could march, shoot, and fight as well as any European army. That respect went both ways. The Americans learned from the French engineers, artillery officers, and disciplined infantry. The alliance worked at Yorktown in a way it hadn't worked anywhere else. That success was fragile and temporary, but for those few weeks in October 1781, it was perfect. The British took the defeat hard. For an empire that had conquered much of the world, losing to a bunch of colonists was humiliating beyond words. The British press savaged Cornwallis and Clinton. Parliamentary debates became shouting matches. The government nearly collapsed. King George III seriously considered abdicating. He wrote a draft abdication speech, but never delivered it. The political fallout in Britain was almost as significant as the military defeat in Virginia. The officers and soldiers who'd surrendered at Yorktown faced years of criticism and second-guessing. Cornwallis eventually recovered his reputation by serving in India, where he won battles and governed competently. But Yorktown haunted him for the rest of his life. Clinton was blamed for not reinforcing Cornwallis, though in fairness, he'd been deceived brilliantly by Washington and couldn't have gotten through de Grasse's fleet anyway. The common soldiers, the 8,000 men who marched into captivity, spent months or years in prison camps. Some were eventually exchanged for American prisoners. Others were paroled. A few deserted and disappeared into the American countryside, deciding they'd had enough of fighting for a king who'd sent them to die in a swamp. The Hessian mercenaries, Germans who'd been rented to the British by their princes, had fought at Yorktown alongside the British regulars. About 2,000 Hessians surrendered. Many of them eventually settled in America after the war. They'd been sent to fight a war they didn't believe in, for a king who wasn't theirs, in a country they didn't care about. When the war ended, some decided to stay. They'd seen enough of the American experiment to believe in it. The irony is thick. Men sent to crush the revolution ended up joining it. That's the power of the American idea, even in 1781. It wasn't just about independence from Britain. It was about the possibility of something new, something better. As for Washington, Yorktown cemented his status as the indispensable man. He'd been the commander-in-chief since 1775, through defeats and disasters, mutinies, and near collapse. He'd held the army and the revolution together through sheer force of will and quiet competence. Yorktown was his masterpiece, the proof that he hadn't just been lucky or stubborn. He was a great general. After the war, he could have made himself king. The army would have followed him. Parts of the public would have supported it. He refused. He resigned his commission and went home to Mount Vernon. That decision, to give up power voluntarily, shocked the world. King George III reportedly said that if Washington really gave up power and returned to his farm, he would be the greatest man in the world. Washington did exactly that. He came back later to serve as the first president, but only because his country asked him to. And after 2 terms, he gave up power again. The precedent he set, that military victory doesn't justify dictatorship, that leaders should step down voluntarily, shaped American democracy forever. Yorktown made that possible. If the war had dragged on, if it had ended in stalemate or a negotiated compromise, Washington might have been pressured to stay in command indefinitely. A quick, decisive victory allowed him to leave on his own terms. The 72 hours that destroyed the British Army at Yorktown created the space for American democracy to be born. Looking back from the 21st century, it's easy to see the American Revolution as inevitable. Of course the colonists would win. Of course they'd create a democracy. Of course America would become a superpower. But none of that was obvious in 1775, or 1776, or even 1780. For most of the war, American independence looked like a fantasy. The British were stronger, richer, more experienced, and better equipped. They had the best navy in the world. They had professional soldiers. They had an empire that stretched across the globe. The Americans had farmers with muskets, a printing press, and an idea. That idea, that people have the right to govern themselves, was powerful. But ideas don't win wars by themselves. You need soldiers willing to fight for the idea. You need generals smart enough to keep those soldiers alive. You need allies willing to help. You need luck. And you need to recognize the moment when all of those factors align. Washington recognized that moment at Yorktown. He marched his army 400 miles, coordinated with a French fleet and army, deceived the British in New York, and besieged Cornwallis into submission. In 72 hours of combat, from the assault on the redoubts to the surrender, he ended the war. 8,000 British soldiers surrendered because Washington had done everything right and Cornwallis had run out of options. It wasn't magic. It wasn't destiny. It was strategy, timing, and execution. The Americans who charged into Redoubt 10 on that dark October night in 1781 didn't know they were changing world history. They knew they had a job to do, and they did it. They climbed over sharpened stakes, fought hand-to-hand with British soldiers, and took that redoubt in 10 minutes. That courage, multiplied across thousands of soldiers over 6 years of war, is what created the United States. Yorktown was the culmination, the moment when all of that sacrifice paid off. The fields outside Yorktown are quiet now. You can walk the trenches and the redoubts. You can stand where Hamilton charged and where the British stacked their arms. It's peaceful. It's hard to imagine the noise, the smoke, the terror of those 72 hours. But if you stand there and close your eyes, you can almost hear the echo of drums, the roar of cannons, and the moment when 8,000 British soldiers realized they'd lost a war they were supposed to win. That moment changed everything. It created a country built on the idea that power comes from the people, not from kings. It proved that a determined group of citizens could defeat an empire. And it established a military tradition that valued innovation, adaptability, and the courage of the common soldier over rigid European tactics. Yorktown wasn't just the end of a siege, it was the birth of a nation. And it happened because a few thousand Americans refused to quit, even when quitting made sense, even when the odds were impossible, even when the world told them they couldn't win. They won anyway. In 72 hours, they ended the war. In doing so, they began something much larger, an experiment in self-government that continues to this day. That's the legacy of Yorktown. Not just a military victory, but the proof that the American idea, for all its flaws and contradictions, could survive the test of war. The 8,000 British soldiers who surrendered didn't just lose a battle, they lost the future. And the Americans who accepted that surrender didn't just win a siege, they won the right to build something new. That's worth remembering.